Pnawn da, everyone. Welcome back to the Housing First Wales online conference. I hope you've enjoyed the day so far. Really enjoyed that last section on mental health and Housing First. Some really great approaches happening up in Greater Manchester and some really good ideas about how we can improve those partnerships here in Wales. Next up, our session is Housing First, Rapid Rehousing and Service Transformation. As we heard in the opening remarks and the ministerial address, Wales is at the precipice of huge change in homelessness services. We have a real opportunity with the Homelessness Action Group recommendations, the Welsh Government's strategy to move towards rapid rehousing and housing-led solutions, and the opportunity to build on the work that we've done during the COVID-19 pandemic to deliver real transformation that delivers lasting change for people in Wales. I'm really delighted that Simon Prothero and Carl Spiller from Welsh Government have joined us today from the Housing Policy team. They're going to be talking about the transformation agenda, about rapid rehousing and where Housing First fits into this picture. We heard earlier in the day from Francesca about how it's so important that Housing First isn't just some kind of discrete model that sits outside of the rest of homelessness system, that it's absolutely vital that it's embedded within the broader preventative and housing-led housing solutions. So today is a really important opportunity to hear a bit more about that. Simon and Carl would like this to be as interactive as possible, so please do offer your comments in the chat box. Please put your questions in the Q&A section. And something that has not been planned, but we're going to give it a go in this session, is if you would like to come on screen and offer your view or ask a question, then you can put your hand up using the hand sign at the bottom of the chat box, and then we'll do our best to bring you in at the appropriate moment so that you can share your views with Simon and Carl. So without further ado, I'll introduce Simon and Carl, who are going to talk to you about this agenda and pose a few questions to you. Thanks both.
Great. Hi, everyone. And first of all, a quick apology. If I keep looking up like that, it's because I've moved my webcam down. So apologies if I'm not making eye contact all the time with you. And then secondly, I'd just like to say how interesting it was hearing from the guys from Manchester and how they really appear to be doing a good job on linking up the substance misuse mental health services, which are really so important to Housing First. And it is a real challenge, and I think it's a challenge for people on both sides of the boundary. But what we absolutely know is if we don't get this right, then we really struggle to provide a person-centered service, and we also fail to really build up resilience in the people who are using services as well. So it was really interesting, and I think there's a lot for us to learn from a Welsh Government perspective from what was said in that session. The other thing that I'd like to reinforce what Katie has said, that if you've got questions, we really, or not so much questions, observations and things to tell us, we are in listening mode and we want to hear your experiences and views. And I suppose I will break that down into three areas. Really, what are the implications for people who are using services as we move further into Housing First and linking up with rapid rehousing? Then secondly, what are the impact on people who are working in services? We are really conscious that if this is going to work, then we need to make sure we take into account the needs and the views of people who are working in services, and particularly from a trauma-informed approach. We talk a lot about trauma-informed approaches, and we usually talk about them in terms of the people who are receiving services and the trauma they're faced. We are really conscious that in the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, you will come in and out of trauma, particularly working with some of the people who have been most damaged by their experiences of trauma. And what we don't want to do is pass that trauma on through the system. And it was interesting hearing the guys from Manchester talking about the staff support that goes on in the work that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And it can be very easy for us as people who are way away from the front line, and our customers are service users, but also ministers, that sometimes we forget the impact on people or don't take enough account of the impact on people who are working on the front line as we're pushing forward leaps and moving forward, which is absolutely essential if we are going to transform services. But I want to make sure we're taking account of your experiences. And then the third part is the impact of the change that we're taking forward on organisations and the way in which organisations operate and work in a strategic way as well, because this is going to be a challenging agenda for absolutely everyone. In terms of the move towards Housing First transformation, the Minister has given you her perspective on it. We are really up for this challenge. One of the things that we are very, very conscious of is that over the past probably 30, even 40 years, that we have moved into a staircase model of homelessness services. And that starts with the assessment that someone has when they come into a service, and then through the prevention steps, if prevention is an option. Then there's things, the priority need tests, and then there's getting into temporary accommodation and the support that is required there. We want to move away from that. One of the things we're very conscious of is that whilst lots of people come into homelessness because they have experienced damage through debt, through domestic abuse, through mental ill health, through other pressures on their lives, what we really want to do is get people into settled accommodation as quickly as possible. Because if we don't get people into their own settled accommodation as quickly as possible, we know that there's a risk while they're in temporary accommodation. One, I can't imagine how traumatic it must be moving into temporary accommodation for the first time. And once you are in temporary accommodation, there are all things going on. First of all, the level of boredom that people must face on a day-to-day basis is hard enough to deal with on its own. If you're also dealing with traumas from the fact that you're homeless, the things that led up to your homelessness, the possibility that you're getting over a relationship breakdown, the fact that you've lost your informal or may have lost your informal support networks, then that's traumatic. And we also know that there are people who, prey on temporary accommodation, and the people who live there all too frequently, and the temptations of things that come into to pass time and just to form relationships with people and to have a meaningful relationship can lead to damage as well. So rapid rehousing is very, very important that we get this right and move forward. And that's not to be dismissive about temporary accommodation. It's been and still is really, really important and really useful to people. But what we want to do is, as far as possible, look towards a future where people don't have to move through steps and don't have to move into lots of different settings before they get their own settled home. We know it's going to be difficult and it's going to be challenging. We know that it's been difficult in Scotland. The pandemic has given us quite a good understanding of how challenging it is. We can't forget how important the homelessness cells have been in multi-agency working. And we know that rapid rehousing, and particularly the end of the spectrum that is Housing First, is really dependent on multi-agency working. So I'm going to stop now and hand over to Carl, who's going to go into a little bit more detail about our vision. And then we really, really want to hear your views and your experiences, and that will help shape the way in which we advise the Minister on the developing policy. The one thing I should be absolutely clear about, we know this is difficult and we want to get it going almost yesterday, but we recognise it's going to take a 5-year period of transformation. That's not to say that we want to leave it and let things carry on as they are for 2 years. We want to get into the planning for that transformation right now, but we do recognise there are also challenges involved. So, Carl, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me, Simon? Seeing as you're the only face I can see, great. Just to confirm that. Great. So housing first and rapid rehousing. I suppose first thing we should say in terms of rapid rehousing, the next immediate stages we have along the journey. As many of you, I'm sure, would have seen the policy paper which we published last month. That wasn't in June, in terms of outlining what our vision for rapid rehousing is across Wales. And there were a number of questions there that we asked of stakeholders to get back to us on as well. So if you've had sight of the policy paper, please do get back to us with those comments. But if you haven't seen that policy paper, hopefully you will have got a sense from Simon's words and from the Minister this morning, the vital position Housing First has in the spectrum of services that we want to deliver under rapid rehousing. It is and also in terms of the importance that Housing First is delivered in a what's the right words, as pure a model in terms of adherence to the principles as possible, because we know that there will be many people out of the many thousands of people in temporary accommodation at the moment, and who will approach services in the future, who will likely only be successful in making that transition to settled accommodation through an intensive form of housing-led stroke housing first service. And the more vulnerable that individual is, then the higher the requirement is that housing first service has as high fidelity as possible. So it's very important that we do champion housing first, and that we support the accreditation process, and we encourage everyone to aim for the highest possible type of service that we can. And I suppose the pandemic has created some challenges with that, because we know that the increased number of presentations has led to some dilution. Was a fidelity fatigue, I think I heard earlier in the conference, has led to some dilution of that, and which I think obviously during a crisis that we've experienced the last 60 months, which is still ongoing. We can't hide from that also. Then that's understandable, and I think almost is supported as long as that we can get to a position where those projects spring back to meeting all of the principles again. So that's one of the key things that I want to raise today, is for those projects that are delivering housing first now, if you are aware of any flex in your model over the last 60 months, to continue to look to see how you can regain that lost adherence ground. I'm sorry, I'm rambling with that one. But in terms to go back to rapid rehousing, we want to take many of the key principles of Housing First and ensure that is stretched across everyone who approaches asking for help. Now there's a webinar tomorrow, and there was a needs mapping webinar last Friday where we outlined the sort of four broad support groups that we are suggesting local authorities assess people into, to sort of help the process of understanding which pathway people need to go down, starting from low and none and no needs, to medium, to high, to intensive needs. Intensive needs is where we would expect people to require 24/7 support and almost certainly be supported in supported accommodation. So that's an important thing there, is to say that actually the rapid rehousing model isn't just about moving people into settled independent accommodation as well. It is actually, we want a more flexible, fluid system than that, which recognises some people at that time in their life will need residential support, and we want to make sure that there's capacity in the system, and the assessment process is able and confident enough to be able to refer people into that journey. But what we want And certainly what tomorrow's webinar will outline, and what we outlined in the needs mapping assessment session last Friday as well, is those people who are designated as high need. We would like Housing First to be the default position or the default support package for those people. Now, as of today, we have no idea in terms of what the share of the 6,000 people in temporary accommodation, what the share is in terms of low, medium, high, and intensive. We've got no idea at all. So it's very difficult for us right now to be able to say if we want Housing First for everyone, what that would look like in terms of the capacity, which is why it's important that authorities, as part of the planning process, start asking the questions now and start understanding the scale of the needs of the people who are in temporary accommodation at the moment. So that's one key thing in terms of where Housing First sits within rapid rehousing. We want it to be the default position for everyone who is designated as high needs. Secondly, we're very keen that we reinforce the needs for high adherence to the Housing First principles, so that it isn't long-term slippage of fidelity fatigue, which might support the majority of people who access services, but will fail the minority of people that if we're honest with ourselves, we have been failing for many decades. So this whole rapid rehousing journey is around making sure that we have a service which is fit for all, and also a recognition that those people who are low and potentially no needs, Housing First is around ensuring that those people are housed as quickly as possible, so that those low needs don't develop into something worse and more of a challenge to tackle if they are sort of left behind or forgotten about in temporary accommodation, because there's a perception that they can they've got more capacity to be able to handle that. This is really about trying to move everyone through the system as quickly as possible, so that no one experiences any adverse trauma that could be avoided. So in terms of the questions for today, I can see some questions popping into the chat now. So I don't know if you can read some of those, Simon, while I carry on wittering away. Certainly, one of the key things that we also want to get your feedback and views on is around how the crossover between Housing First and rapid rehousing, because we know obviously what we have currently are a number of projects in Wales which are working, I wouldn't say so much in isolation, but certainly not as part of the mainstream support within homelessness services. So I think we need to find a way to ensure that those people who have often gone through values-based recruitment, to ensure that those values, that trauma-informed culture that's developed in those Housing First projects, how we can ensure that that seeps across to the whole homelessness team. So I think that's one challenge that Simon and I would welcome your views on today, and also that crossover between Housing First and rapid rehousing. Obviously, we're still speaking in the theoretical at the moment, because I don't think there are any services in Wales that potentially have a rapid rehousing and Housing First projects that are working side by side. But certainly we would welcome your views in terms of how we can ensure a seamless crossover. So we aren't talking about completely different teams in different locations. We're talking about, as far as the applicant and the person who's going through services, it all seems a seamless exercise. Then there might be issues there in terms of marketing and branding that we need to think about, so that there isn't a have and have nots type approach for people who are going through services as well. All things that we really would value your views on. And I suppose the third and final thing that I wanted just to raise as well is around the actual model of Housing First. And we know there isn't an off-the-shelf model for Housing First. That's why we have principles. That's why there are principles across the world. But what we have in Wales is a model which is sort of developed out of some of the early pilots around someone being placed in temporary accommodation until they found settled accommodation. Now, pre-pandemic, potentially that stay could be as long as 8 or 9 or 10 weeks. We know as a result of the pandemic, that stay is much longer now. So that raises the question in terms of about Housing First. in terms of what the priority should be. Should there be priority to move people out of temporary accommodation into, even if it's potentially a permanent residence, but on a temporary contract? What should be the priority? Now, say in Wales, we've been driven by the sector, we've been driven by the ideas that from the projects that we've piloted, and from the projects that we haven't piloted. We've been led by that, and we've been interested to know how things work, and we still sort of in test mode, I suppose, as well as listening mode in terms of what potentially does work in Wales. But I think with the very real challenge that we have with 6,000 people in temporary accommodation, and the need to make the transition over the 5-year period, I think it's definitely worth asking the question in terms of how that model should look in the short term, and how that model should look in the long term. And do we even recommend a model? Do we allow for there to be flexibility in terms of what's available locally? I know from speaking to colleagues in Scotland that there's a rural housing first project which relies on their model is very much based on moving people out of temporary accommodation within 7 days, moving them into a short-term social tenancy on a 3-month contract, if I remember correctly, but with the view that if the individual settles there and if everyone is happy, then that 3-month contract can be converted into something more permanent. But that's just one example of maybe another way of doing things. So we're happy for your views, for your challenge. So over to you with questions.
Thanks very much, both. So yes, please do put your questions and comments into the chat. And if you would like to come on screen and join us, then do put up your hand using the hand symbol at the bottom of the chat box, and we'll try and get you on with your webcam and microphone. So we've had a few questions in. So a really great question actually from Jordan, who's asked, is there any education available to external agencies on rapid rehousing, as it is something that causes confusion in steering groups? And I guess that's a really valid point, because I think the sector in Wales is trying to get used to the term rapid rehousing and understand what it really means in the Welsh context. So, I guess that is really important, isn't it? Particularly if we want multi-agency cooperation for people with higher support needs. So is that something that's part of your planning moving forward? Obviously, you've done some webinars with local authority housing colleagues. We're doing the session today and hope to do another one in a few weeks with the broader sector. But, other agencies will be key to this, won't they?
Yeah. We are close to the beginning of our journey on this, and the policy paper outlines our initial vision for rapid rehousing. But one of the things we're really conscious of is that for staff who are working in projects at the front of house will need some training, but also people who are managing projects, people who are commissioning services will need more input. So, and we're looking at workforce issues across the board. So training is certainly one of the things we'll be considering. What I'd also say in terms of resources to really start understanding rapid rehousing, there's some really good, very, very basic principles videos on YouTube. So if you've got no idea about rapid rehousing, I'd suggest that's a good starting point. If you want to get more into the detail of the planning of services, it's no secret that Scotland have done this work in front of us, and we are talking very, very closely to our colleagues, not only in the Scottish government, but also in the voluntary sector who are working in Scotland and in local government in Scotland. So I'd really recommend taking a look at some of the documents around rapid rehousing, the Indigo House documents and planning guidance that they introduced. There's some technical stuff in there that might be a bit boring for some people, not for geeks like policy officials in the Welsh government, I'm afraid to say. But there's also a lot of description of the model there and how the model is intended to work. And I think in fairness to our colleagues in Scottish Government, will be using that quite intensely. There's another word beginning with P, but I won't use that. But we've got their agreement that we shall will be working closely with them on it.
Thanks very much, Simon. And we've just put in the handout section of the chat bar, we've just put the policy paper from Welsh Government. So do take a look at that. It's available in English and in Welsh. And we'll add a couple of links as this session progresses with the Scottish documents as well. So hopefully you can look through those resources afterwards. Also a reminder that we held a webinar that was focused on rapid rehousing a few months ago, and we had the local authority lead up in Fife speaking about how they embedded a rapid rehousing approach up there. So we'll also dig out that link and put that into the handout section. That's definitely worth a watch to understand the challenges and how they work through those up in Scotland.
And can I just add to that? John Mills is going to be talking to local authorities at this seminar tomorrow, and I think it listening to him at your seminar last year, Katie, was really inspirational for me. And it was listening to John speak that was when the light bulb came on inside my head and thought, this is just so logical and sensible. And, it's very, very helpful what he had to say there, and kind of understanding the journey they went on and the challenges, but actually the principles about why it's such a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Lynn has put in a comment saying that in Carmarthenshire, rapid rehousing is currently commissioned as separate service to Housing First. It's using some of the Housing First principles in order to, I guess, guide the nature of that service to support people in temporary accommodation, but they're very much separate at the moment. And is your vision really to see a much more integrated kind of homelessness system where those are kind of operating alongside each other?
Absolutely. We don't, obviously things might be working slightly differently behind the scenes, but to someone presenting, we don't want there to be a different level of service, just a service which meets their needs. So if the assessment identifies that someone is high needs and requires Housing First service, they should go down that channel. But as far as that seamless nature between Housing First and rapid rehousing, that's what we want to achieve. And in terms of the comment I made earlier around the cultural, we know moving to rapid rehousing is going to require quite a significant change in culture, because the UK government have had for decades worth of legislative frameworks which have dictated homelessness services are delivered in a certain way. And now we want to change that, but for some people who've worked under the previous frameworks, it will be a challenge to change the way of working. And what we have in the Housing First teams that we have now in actually most local authorities across Wales at various states of maturity, we have those teams that are working in a different culture and a different mindset. But often, and part of it is because they are mobile officers. They don't often stay in the office for very long during their sort of working week. But it's we have that potential cultural stimulus there. Is how do we also get that spread across an entire organisation, an entire service? But certainly, what we want is those two Housing First and rapid rehousing teams to be working side by side, and not for there to be any real differences.
And I'd add to that, but I think historically what we've seen is that in some areas within local authority teams, that the HSG housing support grant teams, or what were supporting people teams, and the homelessness teams were really well integrated and were bouncing off each other, and services were built based on the experience of the homelessness teams. But in some areas, maybe things aren't as joined up as that. And it's not just in terms of this isn't a housing solution, it's a whole system solution. And too often, historically, we've seen homelessness often really pushed into the homelessness team as they are the people who will solve it, whilst we've given almost the legislative duties have gone on the homelessness team, the revenue resources have gone to what were the supporting people teams, and the capital resources either went to the capital housing strategy team within the local government, or they went externally to social landlords. The whole point of behind the rapid rehousing approach, it's not just getting people into their own stable housing as quickly as possible. It's about linking up homelessness, understanding housing need, understanding support and revenue funding for support. And most crucially, what I would personally criticise myself for that I've missed off in the past is the capital funding, so that we move to a situation in Wales where we are building new housing that reflects not only the wider community and not only our aspirations as a community, but actually the intense housing need of people who haven't got housing, which we've missed a trick there. And we're starting that work at the moment, and it's not, surprisingly, and this shouldn't be a surprise, joining up those ways of working, those methodologies and those cultures is challenging. And I think one of the reasons it's most challenging is because people still perceive homeless families and individuals as being different to us, and they're not. They're our friends, they're our neighbours, they're our families, and really changing that culture that homelessness isn't something different. It's us, and it's people like us, to coin a phrase.
Definitely. Thanks, Simon. Alex Smith, who leads on Housing First in England, has asked a question about whether any thought has been given to the critical time intervention model. This is something that is fairly well integrated with Housing First in Denmark and is starting to gain some traction in England, something that focuses more on community integration at the point of transition into housing and is time limited. And I know there's a pilot that Crisis South Wales are doing in Swansea, aren't they? Specifically focused around leaving prison.
Yeah, that's the only critical time intervention project that I'm aware of in Wales. We did include CTI in the phase 2 guidance as something which we recommended authorities looked at very closely. And it's certainly not off our radar at all. It's just we've got a shortage of evidence in terms of how it works. Personally, I think it's certainly, in terms of, you mentioned that Swansea project for people in HMP Swansea. I think people leaving institutions, there's a real value and real benefit if it's targeted there. And one thing we haven't mentioned today is around the entire theme of targeted prevention activity that falls under rapid rehousing, which is around identifying those most at-risk groups and delivering bespoke solutions. I can see a few reasons why not and why it'll be a challenge. But certainly, I think in terms of delivering CTI potentially as a default position for most people leaving prison could be something that we explore. Hopefully, over the next 5 years, we'll have a much better understanding before we step fully into fully integrated rapid rehousing homelessness services. But it's on our radar. It's just something that we haven't had the opportunity to pick up any data on yet, really.
And I guess there's a real focus, isn't there? One of the many recommendations out of the Homelessness Action Group report to deliver that targeted prevention work. So, potentially CTI being one of those key models that could be utilised in those situations. I've had another question. So I think this is floating support, F/S. Where do you envisage floating support, hopefully, fitting in with rapid rehousing and Housing First?
It's absolutely integral to both models and different levels of intensity. One of the things that we have done some talking about, and I'll let you come in after me, Carl, because you're probably much more informed in the in many areas than I am, that floating support, I think historically, certainly in the policy work we were doing a few years ago, we saw floating support more as a preventative approach, and we knew that it was a part of resettling into settled housing. But I get what rapid rehousing will do is bring a much greater balance between the floating support that is provided as an intervention to prevent homelessness, and then the floating support that is available to help people get back into housing. And one of the areas that that has been talked about as well is almost there's an assertive outreach approach around rough sleeping and housing first. And what we will need to work out with yourselves and across local authorities and providers is how that assertive outreach model or rapid deployment of floating support works with people who are getting back into housing as well. So more of a spectrum of, and I think maybe 10 years ago, there were some of those approaches within floating support. And then when there were cuts, they were some of the services that got pulled back. So we'll be looking back in history a little bit as well. Carl, would you?
No, I'd agree completely. I think floating support will be an absolutely critical part of rapid rehousing. In terms of say, hopefully upstream in the prevention activity, so that instead of having stats which tell us that only a quarter of our successful prevention activity allows someone to remain in their home, you know, we can help people at a much earlier stage, so that we can get much nearer 100% for that successful prevention rate. Floating support will be absolutely critical for that, as will the support to help stabilise people in new accommodation, rather than potentially, and it's not to say that all projects do this, but we know historically over the years that once someone does find accommodation, there might be about a week's worth of post-placement support before the support is sort of leaves that individual. With rapid rehousing, it's about understanding that some people might need a little longer just to settle in. Some people might need that emergency telephone number if there's any issues, no matter how small or big, and just that floating support needs to be flexible, so that it can flex depending on the needs of individuals, and it can help to stabilise people. It can help to move people from temporary accommodation. They can be that support worker which helps them to make that transition. So absolutely critical, which is why we've got the extra £40 million of the HSG. I think everyone knows that the important role HSG is going to play, not just now with the pandemic, but long term as well.
Absolutely, and I think for me that signals a change in culture and expectations with some of the commissioning that we see as well. So, as we've had increased numbers coming through the system and a decade of austerity, there has been a tendency in some areas to focus on, giving people support for a very short period of time in order to see more people and churn people through the system. And we know that just results in people coming round again to the system at crisis point, and actually making sure that we can give people that support for as long as they need it, that we understand their support needs, but also that they feel confident to be able to dip in when they're hitting a potential crisis, in order to try and avoid that and benefit to the person using the service, but also to the public sector and public spending. One of the things that I wanted to kind of ask is really tying this to some of the conversations that are happening about needs assessments and the housing support strategies. And I guess we have an opportunity now more than ever to have a much greater understanding of the population with experience of homelessness, because pre-COVID, many people were hidden homelessness, and for many people, they'd not felt able to engage with services, and actually the pandemic has kick-started that engagement. So I certainly feel that we've got this real opportunity to make a significant difference to those people in particular. But local authorities and partners need to make sure that this is evidenced in needs assessments, don't they? They need to make sure that it's in the strategy, because my understanding is that £40 million that we got last year, we want that to be the baseline. But inside Welsh Government, you need to be able to kind of evidence that. And I guess the needs assessments and strategies that local authorities will be working on in the coming months will be quite critical for that.
Yeah, the evidence is more than critical, and it's a way in which, for years you have talked to us about the need, and the whole sector has talked to us about the need, and fair dues, politicians have produced the money and prioritised this area of work. It is those needs assessments and developing not an onerous level of detail, but a detailed understanding of who is in temporary accommodation and how long that they've been there, is how we demonstrate that cash is going, that revenue funding is going to be used appropriately, but also how we lever in the new housing over the next 5 years, new housing or converted housing. I think I've talked a little bit about housing supply. Housing supply is a huge problem in Wales at the moment, and we will need to work very closely with social landlords. We'll need to work really closely with private sector landlords, and we need to really, one, understand the numbers of housing units that are required, but also understand how we allocate housing to people as well, and that rapid rehousing doesn't turn into a means of getting, historically, people saw homelessness, or the popular press saw homelessness as a route into social housing. What we want to do here is make sure that we've got our housing supply and cross sectors to match up to housing need, which we see so starkly at the moment in terms of temporary accommodation that we couldn't see historically.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Simon. And we've had a couple of comments in, and then I'll pose the last question to you guys. So as Hannah said, it really can take time to find the right home. Sometimes it can be quick, other times it can take months. And I guess one of the things that we reflected on earlier is that, it might not be that the home that you move into is your forever home, and it's okay for that not to be the forever home. It's okay for them to change your tenancy. We know that people's lives change. But I guess one of the very tricky balances we'll have to find, really, particularly, as you say, at a time when we don't have the housing stock we need, is what we do in the interim period, and trying to make sure that we can get the best quality housing that is right for that person within the kind of means that we have at the moment, obviously with the ambition to have 20,000 social homes at the end of this term. Comment from Swansea, just lost it. Debbie from saying that she runs rapid rehousing and housing first projects in Swansea. We use the same principles as much as possible. The difference is the level of support, and I guess that is absolutely what you're trying to get across around rapid rehousing. It's that spectrum, isn't it? And I think the windscreen wiper is in the policy paper that we've shared in the handout, which is about the intensity of support the closer you get to housing first. So last couple of questions before we end this. I guess one of the things, so there's a question from the audience, what do you foresee as some of the difficult embedded ways of working that need to change? And what should people be focusing on that are currently the barriers to working in this way? And secondly, I guess all of this talk of transformation and changing services can be quite destabilising for the sector. And I guess just assurance from you, really, that this isn't about just going around decommissioning services, that what we want to see is local authorities in conversation with support providers. And if the current model is not the sort of thing that we want to see in the future, working alongside them to adapt rather than casting aside some really brilliant organisations who've delivered some really vital services, and working with them to adapt and make sure that we retain all that expertise as we move through the transformation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a policy development in Wales, this is a really high risk policy for the stability of some organisations, because effectively what we are talking about is switching from temporary accommodation and temporary supported accommodations in some cases to stable homes for people to live in, and moving away from the earned reward systems. And we as Welsh Government need to understand the implications of that. And I think one of the high risks that we have is that the funding models for supported housing, and for some very big organisations are dependent on supported housing and are dependent on the money that comes in through housing benefit in supported housing. And we're different from other parts of the UK because we have a housing support grant and we have housing benefit. So it's how we work together to navigate through this system and change the models without losing the organisations and the commitment that comes through a long history of really, really positive approach to homelessness and housing with support, whether that's supported housing or floating support, and the knowledge across Wales around understanding the needs of people and the expertise. So we're very, very conscious of that, and yeah, it is a risky strategy in that way.
And I guess, you know, what no one is saying is no supported accommodation. That's absolutely one of the options under rapid rehousing. So we don't want people to go away and think that rapid rehousing is just a one size fits all model, that it's a 1-bedroom flat and that's all. You know, we know that for some people, obviously, it'll be help to move into a PRS setting without any support needed. There'll be other people who very much need to be in a social home with lots of support around people in a Housing First project, but also for some people, supported housing will be the right decision. And it's about making sure that we understand the different needs of people in the system and get the right solution for them, whatever that might be. Final comment from Lynn is biggest concern currently is the majority of people in temporary accommodation have complex needs, prison and care leavers, domestic abuse, mental health, substance misuse. Is there sufficient Housing First provision available once resettlement is completed? And I guess there isn't enough at the moment, but the ambition of Welsh Government is to scale up Housing First, and some of that funding through the HSG can be used to upscale Housing First within different areas in Wales and to start. And I know that Carl has been working closely with local authorities to progress those conversations. So I think the answer is, Lynn, not at the moment, but the ambition is there to scale up Housing First and make sure people get the support they need. But I absolutely hear you that for many people, particularly those who've not felt able to engage for the past 10 or 15 years, having Housing First ready for them is absolutely critical if we're not going to lose them in the system again. Simon, Carl, thank you very much. I hope those questions and comments have been helpful in some of your thinking. I'm sure we'll continue this conversation. I think we're hoping to do a webinar with yourselves and others in a few weeks to follow up on your local authority webinars to make sure that the whole sector is engaged in this conversation. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy days today to be here with us. That was a really useful session. Please do check out, before we close this webinar, the handout section. I've put a number of documents in there for people to look at, but I'll ask Gwyn to circulate those again when we do a thank you email out to all delegates. Thanks very much, everyone, and we'll start the next section at 3:35, so you've got 10 minutes for a break. That'll be Housing First for Women from the UK to the USA, and we're delighted to be hearing from Louisa Steele from Standing Together in England, and Linda Olson from Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Abuse will be joining us from across the Atlantic. See you all in 10 minutes. Thanks again, Simon and Carl.